This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Canada, where a devastating national inquiry has determined that the frequent and widespread disappearance and murder of Indigenous girls and women is a genocide that the Canadian government itself is responsible for. This chilling conclusion was reported by the Canadian National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls at a ceremony on Monday with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the families of victims. Many in the audience held red flowers to commemorate the dead. This is Marion Buller, the Chief Commissioner of the inquiry, speaking at the ceremony, which was held at the Canadian Museum of History.
The significant, persistent and deliberate pattern of systemic racial and gendered human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses, perpetuated historically and maintained today by the Canadian state, designed to displace Indigenous people from their lands, social structures and governance, and to eradicate their existence as nations, communities, families, and individuals is the cause of the disappearances, murders, and violence experienced by Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people, and this is genocide.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
The messages that they gave us, like we were heathens, we were pagans. My way of life was no good.
And it shows you that there's a dramatic contradiction in our country, so much so that the former Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples said that Canada is itself this incredible contradiction in terms. It is a champion and defender of human rights. It has incredible protections for Indigenous peoples, yet it has committed violations under every single human rights protection. Today, there isn't a single human rights protection in Canada that isn't currently being violated by Canada with regards to Indigenous peoples. So sometimes we have to be very specific and look at the conditions of very specific groups. I mean, Indigenous peoples only make up 5% of the population in Canada, but more than 20% don't have access to clean drinking water in a country that's exceptionally wealthy. 40% of all homeless people in Canada are Indigenous, but if you look at specific provinces, it's as high as 90%. We have a massive health crisis, not just the one that occurred over the last few years, but over many decades. We suffer the highest rates of chronic illnesses and diseases, the highest rates of accidents, and the #1 cause of death for our youth is suicides. Canada's First Nations have the highest suicide rates in the world and have held that record for 25 years, including war-torn countries. How can that be, and how many people know about that? For women and children, it's much worse. More than 60% of Indigenous families live in poverty. Children live in poverty. The overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prison is in a crisis that keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The fastest growing prison population in our country is actually little Indigenous girls. In some institutions, 98% of all of their inmates are Indigenous girls. In a year, it'll be 100%. So while crime and arrests are going down for the rest of the population and Canada looks like it's moving ahead, it isn't for Indigenous peoples. What about the rate of murdered and missing and disappeared women in Canada? There's more than 4,000. I mean, the whole concept of disappeared Indigenous women isn't something that anyone would ever have associated with Canada. We're the #1 targets of human traffickers. More than 40% of our Indigenous women, little girls, and babies are kidnapped and trafficked by human traffickers for one reason and one reason only: complete impunity. There are no consequences in our society for violence against Indigenous women. It's almost 100% impunity rate. Over 30,000 Indigenous children have been stolen from our communities and are placed in foster care. And statistically, we know what this means. That's a pipeline to jail and suicide. Or they'll end up like poor Tina Fontaine from Winnipeg being pulled out of a river. The state of Canada, the vision that we had for Canada, is evaporating before our very eyes. No Canadian wants to live in a Canada where Indigenous people can't walk down the street without fear of being murdered. We are literally in a state of emergency. The number of Indigenous women in federal prisons have gone up by 90%. Just in the last decade, 90%. Some of our prisons are 85% Indigenous men and women. That's not the Canada that we created. And worst of all, Indigenous peoples live 7 to 20 years less than regular Canadians because of extreme poverty. In the most wealthiest country in the world, we have people without running water. The very first documented cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women started in 1749 when Governor Cornwallis enacted scalping bounties against Mi'kmaq women and children and Mi'kmaq men. So 10 guineas were paid for their murder for the express purpose to decimate our populations. And some people might think that's a really extreme example, but the law never changed. Because after that came smallpox blankets, and after that came a forced sterilization of Indigenous women across the country, and after that came the theft of their children in schools, where lots of little girls were murdered, raped, and tortured. And so this pattern of violence against Indigenous women by state actors has been in place for so long that it seems to have become the norm, that it's something that we don't even see anymore unless the media makes a big deal about it. And so you have this scenario where the law has not only created violence against Indigenous women, but it maintains it both in specific laws like the Indian Act, where Indigenous women and their children lose their status and lose their homes and don't have access to fundamental human services like housing and water, but also in the violation of law, this situation is maintained. So the failure to abide by human rights laws, the failure to abide by treaties, the failure to abide by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, all of these gross violations of our own laws here in Canada maintain this situation. And so we have a scenario where people are asking, what are the root causes of this? And the root causes are laws that are currently on the books. Those scalping laws are still on the books. Somehow it's okay to celebrate people like Governor Cornwallis and name schools after them, despite the fact that they murdered our Indigenous women and girls. So we have a big problem in Canada in terms of how do we educate Canadians on all of those uncomfortable truths about why we have this problem.